Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Please subscribe and keep watching more details. Why did Todd Chrisley turn down the plea deal? Chrisley Knows Best stars Todd Chrisley and his wife, Julie, turned down the plea deal and opted to go to trial. Speculation about their sentence came even before the trial started. At first, people assumed they would serve about 4 to 5 years for tax evasion. However, they ended up with a 19-year concurrent sentence. Certainly, it would be interesting to know what the plea deal offered. What were Todd Chrisley and Julie's convictions for? While most people talk about tax crimes and how harsh the sentences of 7 and 12 years were, there were other changes. They included 12 counts of tax evasion, bank and wire fraud, and conspiracy. You might remember that the jury found them guilty on all charges. Perhaps because of the added fraud-related charges, the plea simply wasn't attractive enough. Joe Geddes from Bravo's Real Housewives also served time in prison, and he suggested that Todd Chrisley made a miscalculation when he took the case to trial. From his own experience, he knew that a lesser sentence would result after a plea deal. That way, the kids wouldn't have been separated from their parents for so long. To this day, Savannah and Chase talk about how her mom and dad wouldn't take a plea because of their innocence. But now, innocent Chloe and Grayson are the ones who suffer. In a recent discussion on Reddit, uz/PettyLaBelle94 wondered about the plea deal they denied. An interesting discussion arose about how murderers and abusers like Josh Duggar served similar sentences. And Savannah's mom and dad didn't kill anyone. From a person who works in legal, followers discovered that when a plea is turned down, it is never made public. So the question about what they were offered can't be answered. Still, that didn't stop people from speculating about the reason for Todd Chrisley taking that road. Some people believe that the former USA Network stars were just way too arrogant to expect a long sentence. One follower opined, on the podcast, Todd would rant about unjust persecution by the government, the gay Department of Revenue, that he was fighting these charges for the everyman who couldn't afford to fight, all while trying to muddy the waters with his nonsense because the feds really had something on him. TV fame would save them? The same follower also said that Julie and Todd Chrisley's egos prevented them from making a sound judgment regarding a plea deal. They added, "I think Todd foolishly believed he could control the narrative. If I was Julie, I would have flipped to save myself for my babies, but she's clearly under his spell for whatever reason." The morning light in Nashville had a way of sneaking through the blinds like an unwanted truth. Todd Chrisley sat at his long kitchen island, coffee steaming in front of him, the pages of legal documents spread out like a game of high-stakes poker. But this wasn't poker, and the stakes weren't chips. They were years of his life. The plea deal had been sitting on his lawyer's desk for a week. The government was offering him less prison time, a smaller fine, and the chance to keep his family somewhat intact during the storm. On paper, it should have been tempting. But Todd Chrisley wasn't the kind of man who liked the taste of almost winning. For Todd, agreeing to a plea meant wearing the label of guilt, something he had fought tooth and nail to reject. In his mind, a plea deal was the government's way of asking him to sign his own confession, to admit that all the years of preaching hard work, family values, and financial savvy were just smoke and mirrors. And Todd was too proud, too stubborn, and too sure of his own narrative to let that happen. The pride factor. Todd's life had always been about control, controlling his image, his household, his business deals, and yes, his hair. On Chrisley Knows Best, he was the quick-witted, immaculately dressed patriarch who could cut through chaos with a one-liner and a credit card. But behind that reality TV gloss, there had been whispers, accusations, and eventually the clang of a gavel. When the plea deal came, his attorney, Mark Whitman, had leaned across the table during their meeting and said, "Todd, this is as good as it's going to get. Take it, and we can move forward." Todd just shook his head. "Mark, if I take that deal, I'm telling my kids their daddy's a criminal. I'm telling my mama I've been lying to her my whole life. I'm not doing it." It wasn't just stubbornness. It was the idea that his story, the Chrisley brand, would be permanently stained. Todd believed that if he fought, there was still a chance to win completely, to walk out of court with his name in. Behind closed doors, the Chrisley family was split. Savannah, ever the fierce defender, sided with her father, telling him, "You've always taught us not to settle for less than we deserve. Why start now?" Julie, however, was quieter, more cautious. She had her own lawyers whispering in her ear, telling her that deals like this don't come twice. But Todd's conviction, no pun intended, was contagious. Even when fear gripped the edges of their conversations, he would find a way to inject humor or bravado, making it sound like turning down the plea was the bold, principled choice rather than a gamble with their future. The belief in beating the system. In Todd's mind, the government had built its case on a house of cards. He saw the inconsistencies, the technicalities, and the places where he believed his lawyers could poke holes. He imagined the dramatic moment in the courtroom when the prosecution's star witness crumbled under cross-examination, when documents were shown to be flawed, when jurors glanced at each other with doubt. He wanted that moment. He wanted the vindication of walking out and saying, "See, I told you so." For a man whose life was lived in the spotlight, that wasn't just a fantasy. It was the only acceptable ending. The brand to protect. Todd Chrisley wasn't just a man. He was a brand. There were TV contracts, endorsement deals, podcast listeners, and an entire fan base that believed in his image as a self-made Southern success story. A plea deal wouldn't just hurt Todd. It would be a nail in the coffin of the Chrisley empire. By turning it down, Todd was betting that a trial could preserve some of that brand power. Even if he lost, he could claim he fought the good fight, that he refused to be bullied into admitting to something he didn't believe he did. In the court of public opinion, that defiance might win him a different kind of victory. The risk factor. Every lawyer knows that trial is a gamble. The plea deal had been the safe bet. Less prison time, a lighter blow. But Todd had always been drawn to risk when the payoff was big enough. His entire career had been built on walking the line between calculated risk and outright audacity. He saw the trial as just another high-stakes game. Maybe the odds weren't in his favor, but Todd was the kind of man who believed he could charm his way out of bad odds. His charisma, his storytelling, his way of making a jury laugh. These were the tools he trusted more than any legal document. The unspoken reason. There was also a quieter, more personal reason Todd turned down the deal. One he didn't say out loud, not even to Julie. Deep down, Todd knew that if he took the plea, it would haunt him forever. Every holiday dinner, every grandchild's birthday, he'd be thinking about how he had bent, how he had surrendered. He had always told his kids that Chrisleys don't quit. To take the plea would be to admit he had been wrong all along, and Todd's ego was built like a fortress against that kind of self-doubt. The aftermath. When the trial ended and the verdict came down, the reality of the decision to reject the plea was clearer. Years in prison loomed, along with the crushing weight of public opinion. But even then, Todd managed to hold his head high. "I didn't take the easy way out," he told Savannah during one of her visits. "They can say what they want, but I know I stood up for myself." Whether that was bravery or folly depended on who you asked. To some, Todd was a man who had gambled with his freedom and lost. To others, he was a man who had refused to let the system break him, even if it meant paying a heavier price. In the end, the question of why Todd Chrisley turned down the plea deal can't be answered by legal strategy alone. It was about pride, principle, family, brand, and the unshakable belief that he could beat the odds. For Todd, the plea deal wasn't just an agreement. It was a surrender. And surrender was something Todd Chrisley had never been willing to do, not in business, not in family, and certainly not in the face of a courtroom. The irony, of course, is that sometimes the most defiant stand you can take is the one that costs you the most. Todd Chrisley made his choice knowing exactly what was at stake, and he chose the hill he wanted to fight on. Whether history will see that as courage or hubris, only time will tell.